17th century Holland saw the creation of some of the greatest portraiture of all time. But it was not only individuals who sat for artists like Hals and Rembrandt. Dutch artists were often called upon to create group portraits, a form of painting which was virtually unknown outside Holland. Frans Hals was the first artist to fully master the technical difficulties of portraying a group whilst still maintaining the individual personality of the component figures. Once in Amsterdam, Rembrandt also turned to this specifically Dutch branch of painting. This is Dr. Nicolaes Tulp, Amsterdam's most famous surgeon of the day. In 1632, this eminent man of science commissioned Rembrandt to paint him at work, dissecting a corpse's arm while 7 of his fellow doctors looked on. The result was one of Rembrandt's most enduring images, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp.
The difficulties of group portraiture is how to arrange the figures, and we know from the few group portraits that have survived by Rembrandt that he really, if you take X-rays of these paintings, you see in some of these paintings at least that he has been searching quite intensely for the right organization of the group.
The first group portrait that he paints in Amsterdam is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. So Dr. Tulp was a member of the Surgeons Guild, he was also a burgomaster. And we see the anatomy lesson going on. It's quite likely that this was a private lesson rather than a public dissection, because Dr. Tulp is showing how to dissect an arm. He's showing the muscles and the tendons of an arm. Usually in a public dissection, you would start at the abdomen. And it's interesting that all of these members of the Surgeon Guild are watching intently at what's going on. They're not blandly staring out at us. And of course, the corpse itself plays a role in this painting. It's almost certainly an executed criminal. Criminals' bodies were used for dissection. So what Rembrandt gives us is not simply a group portrait, he actually animates the event into a history painting.
Rembrandt returned to the genre of group portraiture for some of the best-known paintings of his career. But whilst biblical paintings and portraits would comprise the bulk of his life's work, he also painted nudes and a small body of landscape paintings. Many believe that the finest of these is this small canvas, The Mill. Admirers of this romantic scene have included the great English landscapists Turner and Constable. It also provides a striking illustration of an ongoing feature of Rembrandt's approach, a restricted palette.
Rembrandt had a limited palette, so we do get blacks, browns and greys, but he also animated those by quite vivid reds as well. And he was always very keen to build up the surfaces of his paintings. There is an old anecdote that he put so much highlight on the nose of one portrait that you could actually pick it up by the nose itself.
By the time Rembrandt was 30, his talent was renowned in Amsterdam. Rembrandt's social status was propelled by his marriage in 1634 to the wealthy Saskia van Ulenbach, a relative of the art dealer with whom Rembrandt had lived 2 years previously. Despite marrying into wealth, Rembrandt was financially reckless. He loaned large sums of money to friends and spent substantial sums on ancient sculptures, Renaissance artworks, and exotic objects from the East. He adopted an unusual approach at auctions, making opening bids so high that all other potential buyers would immediately lose interest. This would eventually lead to real financial difficulties for Rembrandt. But in the early years of his marriage, Rembrandt's main priority would not be money. In 1635, Saskia gave birth to a son, Rumbertus. Tragically, he died just a few months later. 2 daughters followed who also died in early infancy. By 1641, Saskia bore a healthy boy, Titus. Unsurprisingly, both son and mother would be popular subjects for Rembrandt's brush. His portraits of Saskia and Titus reveal not only the artist's trademark palette and his mastery of chiaroscuro, but his sheer love of his family. If the loss of his infant children affected Rembrandt the man, it fails to reveal itself in images like this. By the end of the 1630s, Rembrandt was not only a great artist in his own right, but was also renowned as a teacher. Pupils came from all over Holland to study in his studio, and many would become significant artists, including Nicolaas Maes and Govert Flink. The prodigious output of paintings from this studio has created a problem for the modern student, because many works that were once thought to be Rembrandt originals have proved to be the work of his students.
In 1968, the Rembrandt Research Project was set up in Amsterdam with money from the Dutch government. Their brief, if you like, was to try to sort out what was a genuine and what was a student painting. And of course, there were also fakes as well. At the start of the century, there were probably 1,000 so-called Rembrandts. By the 60s, that had gone down to 600, and nowadays we probably think there's something between 400 and 500.
To begin with, it took quite long before we had to admit that most non-Rembrandt, so to say, must have been from the studio and from students. But then there are groups of works by students which sort of run parallel and are dependent on the works of Rembrandt. So once you have these pairs of work by the master and a copy, you develop an eye for what is Rembrandt and what is the students.
The uncertainty that surrounded some of the paintings produced in Rembrandt's studio is matched by details of the artist himself. There are long periods of time when there are virtually no surviving documents mentioning his existence, and actual quotes from Rembrandt himself are almost non-existent. We do know that in 1639 he purchased this house, number 4, Remrnf, in the Jewish quarter of the city. The price was 13,000 florins. Despite Rembrandt's apparent financial success, he borrowed the money to buy number 4 Remrnf. Rembrandt's marriage to Saskia had brought with it a dowry of 20,000 florins. His individual portraits sold for 500 florins each, and his many students each paid 100 florins a year for the privilege of working alongside him. In 1640, the death of Rembrandt's mother meant a financial inheritance. But despite all this wealth, he chose not to use it to pay off his mortgage, preferring instead to indulge his passion for possessions.
We know from several painters that they had a collection, but it more or less was only paintings and, well, some sculpture and maybe some cloth, but that was it. And the way Rembrandt collected almost every part collectors could collect, antiquities, paperwork, things from nature, and also ethnographic objects, which were the 4 main areas they collected. Rembrandt had all of them, and that's rather unusual.
Rembrandt's financial recklessness took years to catch up with him. By the early 1640s, he was still a wealthy man, but in 1642, his fortunes began to change. In his personal life, it was a tragic year. On the 14th of June, his beloved wife Saskia died. The deaths of 3 children had affected her own health. Rembrandt's only consolation was that Saskia's final child, Titus, would survive into adulthood. Before his wife's death, Rembrandt had completed a group portrait commissioned by a militia company, one of many groups of civic guards that emerged in the larger Dutch towns and cities following the withdrawal of the Spanish. Their leaders were often men of the highest status in Dutch society. Here we can see the high status of Captain Frans Banning Kok. Alongside his lieutenant, he dominates the foreground with the Rembrandt mastery of light contributing strongly to this effect. All are involved in what appears to be more a narrative action scene than a group portrait. This is a very different image from the anatomy lesson of the years before, and it is possibly the most famous painting of Rembrandt's career, The Night Watch.
The Night Watch is very important, and what's new about it is that before Rembrandt, of course, these paintings were made, but all the compositions were very dull, one head next to each other, and Rembrandt made a new composition out of it, which is very difficult to arrange such an enormous group of people, and also using his very famous clair-obscur in defining and structuring the painting. That's what it makes the Night Watch to a masterpiece.
In the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, he managed to sort of organize a group of people in a very direct, telling way. But in the case of the Night Watch, he had this intention to depict the moment in which the chaos of people running around and appearing from an archway into a well-organized grouping, and that is the gesture of the man in the foreground, Banningcock, to his lieutenant, etc. So there's a chaos which is about to brought into order, and he must have thought that was the best way to introduce really life itself instead of sort of a military parade.
The Night Watch was one of the most remarkable paintings of the Dutch century, and it also marks a significant turning point in Rembrandt's life. Rembrandt was receiving fewer valuable portrait commissions. It has been suggested that the Night Watch itself was to blame for this. According to this opinion, Rembrandt's work was simply too original, and wealthy patrons now grew reluctant to trust such a virtuoso artist with their commissions. A more likely explanation is that a fashion for intricately detailed paintings now began to emerge, in the tradition of earlier Dutch painters such as Jan van Eyck. Rembrandt's work developed differently, with his brushwork in particular defying the trends of his time.
Rembrandt's brushwork was used as a kind of personal statement. You could recognise a Rembrandt by the brushwork. Some people have actually gone as far to say that he used this very heavily laden brushwork to actually disguise the amount of effort that went into it. By looking at a Rembrandt, you couldn't actually tell how long it had taken him to paint.
Brushwork never is a separate thing, so to say. Brushwork is always in the service of illusion, and you have from early on areas where the brushwork is rough. But it's true that somewhere in the late 40s, 50s, he must have deliberately mirrored himself to Titian, who the late Titian became famous for his rough brushwork. And chosen for a rougher brushwork, but not rough as a means in itself. It had a function at the same time.
After 1642, Rembrandt's commissions were dwindling, and this caused him to default on his payments for his home. And by the end of the decade, Rembrandt's creditors were beginning to grow restless. His finances also suffered as a result of a tempestuous affair with his son's nurse, which ended with Rembrandt paying for her committal to an asylum. But Rembrandt's work was still widely known, increasingly through his work in an entirely different medium, a medium which he may not have invented, but which he brought to an unsurpassed level of artistic achievement: etching. To make an etching, the artist first coats a copper plate with wax, before etching in his image using a needle. He then immerses the plate and wax within a basin of acid. The acid bites through the etching into the plate below, from which prints can then be taken.
The copper plate was inked and then cleaned so that the ink was only could only stay in the lines. Then a piece of paper, a little bit wet paper, was added to it, was laid on top of it, and then you could turn the wheel, and then the copper plate and the paper was transported under this cylinder here, and the ink was pressed out of the copper plate onto the piece of paper. And what you have then is a mirror image of the image on the copper plate.
Compared with woodcutting, the etching technique allows for greater expressive detail than the woodcut technique that had preceded it. From early in his career, Rembrandt exploited etching as a medium in its own right, and the results were a timeless collection of images. Many of these images can be seen in Rembrandt's old house on the Breestraat. Early in the 20th century, the Rembrandt House Foundation was formed, and it has been its responsibility to collect and maintain this priceless collection of Rembrandt's graphic work. This is believed to be Rembrandt's father, who died when his son was just 23. His mother can also be seen in several portraits, but perhaps it is this 1647 image that fully reveals what a master portraitist could achieve with the etching technique. This is Jan 6, an influential figure in Amsterdam. Some years later, 6 was the subject for one of Rembrandt's finest portraits in paint.
Rembrandt, a very skilled and extraordinary draftsman, and it may well be that making etchings was a way to bring this quality of his out into the open, because drawings usually didn't get to the public.
It made him a lot of money. It allows for the reproduction of his ideas and the dissemination of his ideas, almost not infinitely, but you can make a lot of copies of etchings, and so that it was profitable for him.
Rembrandt chose the same subject matter for his etchings as he did for his work in paint. This is especially true with his religious images. Here, Rembrandt has again derived his inspiration from the story of the raising of Lazarus to create an image full of light and drama. The moment when Christ drove the money changers from the temples can also be seen here. But of all Rembrandt's religious etchings, it is this image of Christ preaching that best expresses his genius with the needle. Completed in 1649, this is a visual representation of events described in chapter 19 of the Book of St. Matthew, a narrative image that became known as the 100 Guilder print.
It is one of Rembrandt's most ambitious and at the same time sensitive works. The art lovers must have been intrigued by it, in that it is half finished. The whole idea of finish with Rembrandt's work was something which fascinated the art lovers. The whole idea of finish was not only in the case of Rembrandt, also Titian and even painters from classical antiquity, and that Rembrandt stopped at a certain point after having very finely elaborated on certain areas in the etching and left other areas in its sketchy, must have fascinated the print lovers.
The 100 Guilder print, otherwise Christ healing the sick, was so called because it fetched the price of 100 guilders at auction. It was an enormous fee. There's another old story that says it's called the 100 Guilders print because that's how much Rembrandt paid to get his own work back.